May 7, 1945. Cold Bay, Alaska. Lieutenant Commander James R. Patterson walked the frost-covered dock as the first LCIL-585 secured its mooring lines against Pier 3. His boots crunched on ice crystals that never fully melted, even in spring. The Aleutian wind cut through his bridge coat as he studied the vessel's hull number, freshly painted in navy gray. 30 of these ships, transferred in complete secrecy, and the Soviets have exactly 15 days to learn everything we know. The LCIL, Landing Craft Infantry Large, stretched 159 feet from bow to stern, displacing 387 tons fully loaded. Patterson had overseen similar training operations before, but never under this timeline, never with this urgency. The Soviet crew was already assembling on the dock, their naval uniforms distinctly different from American issue, their expressions betraying both exhaustion from the Trans-Pacific crossing and apprehension about what came next. He pulled the transfer manifest from his inner pocket. 30 vessels, each capable of carrying 188 combat-loaded troops directly onto hostile beaches, each equipped with forward-mounted ramps, 5 20mm Ehrlichen cannons, and a cruising range of 8,000 nautical miles at 12 knots. These were not simple boats. They were the backbone of America's island-hopping campaign, proven from Tarawa to Okinawa. The shocking detail lay not in the ships themselves, but in their destination. These vessels had been earmarked for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands, scheduled for November 1945. Intelligence estimates projected casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Every landing craft would be needed. Yet here they sat, 1,900 miles north of Seattle, being handed over to an ally whose naval amphibious doctrine was, by American standards, virtually non-existent. Patterson understood the strategic calculation. The Yalta Conference had secured Soviet entry into the Pacific War. Stalin had promised to attack Japanese forces in Manchuria within 3 months of Germany's surrender. That surrender had come on May 2nd, just 5 days ago. The clock was ticking. The Red Army was a juggernaut on land, but the Soviet Navy lacked the capability to project that power across water. Without amphibious vessels, the vast Japanese holdings in Sakhalin, the Kurils, and coastal Manchuria would remain untouchable. Project Hula, the code name for this operation, was the solution. Transfer the capability wholesale. Train Soviet crews on American equipment. Do it fast enough to matter, quietly enough that Japan wouldn't notice until it was too late. But 15 days. Patterson had trained American crews for 8 weeks and still watched them struggle with the intricacies of beaching procedures, tide calculations, and the split-second timing required to drop ramps under fire. The Soviets would get 2 weeks. He watched as the first Soviet officers approached, led by a stocky captain whose chest bore decorations Patterson didn't recognize. Through an interpreter, they began the formal transfer ceremony. Papers were signed. Salutes exchanged. The LCI-585 ceased to be an American vessel and became DS-1, Desantny Ship, Landing Ship 1 in Soviet registry. 29 more transfers would follow through July. Each crew would spend 9 to 15 days learning navigation, engine maintenance, beaching procedures, defensive govery, and damage control. Then they would sail west, across the North Pacific, and down the Kamchatka coast to Petropavlovsk, where the Soviet Pacific Fleet was assembling for operations that remained, for now, classified even from the Americans conducting the training. Patterson couldn't shake a simple thought as he walked back toward the operations building. These ships are going into combat, soon, and we're sending them with crews who've barely mastered the throttle. What he couldn't know, what no one at Cold Bay could know on that cold morning in May, was just how soon would be, and how catastrophically brief the window between training and battle would become. The journey to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, though not in Alaska and not with the Soviets. The LCI-L design emerged from a desperate 1942 requirement. The U.S. Navy needed a vessel that could land substantial infantry forces directly onto hostile beaches without requiring established port facilities. Traditional transports required protected harbors. The Navy needed something that could cross oceans, then drive straight onto sand under fire. The Bureau of Ships issued specifications in May 1942. The vessel had to displace no more than 400 tons to permit construction at smaller shipyards. It needed a range of 8,000 miles to reach Pacific Islands from forward bases. It required forward ramps to permit rapid troop discharge. And it had to be producible in large numbers, hundreds, not dozens. 10 separate shipyards received contracts. The design that emerged was 159 feet long with a 23-foot beam, powered by 8 General Motors 671 diesel engines driving 2 propeller shafts. Maximum speed 15.5 knots, though fuel economy dropped catastrophically above 12 knots. Troop capacity 188 men in what could charitably be described as compact conditions. Armament: 5 20mm Oerlikon cannons, 2 forward, 2 amidships, 1 aft, plus whatever additional guns could be bolted to available deck space. The first LCI-L1 commissioned on February 28, 1943. By the end of that year, 351 were in service. Their combat debut came on September 9, 1943, at Salerno, Italy. 36 LCI-Ls participated in the initial assault waves. At 03:30, the first vessels grounded on Red Beach and Green Beach, ramps dropping as German artillery opened fire from prepared positions in the hills above the landing zone. LCI-L36 took a direct hit from an 88mm shell at 03:47, killing 12 men in the troop compartment. LCI-L41 struck a mine at 04:15, breaking her keel and sinking in 14 feet of water. But the remainder pushed through. By dawn, 4,200 troops were ashore with their equipment. By noon, the beachhead was secure enough to bring in the second wave. The LCI-Ls performed as designed. They crossed the Mediterranean, drove onto hostile beaches, and put troops into the fight fast enough to matter. Commander Harold T. Duterman, commanding Transport Division 9, filed his after-action report on September 15th. The LCI-L has proven capable of executing its primary mission under combat conditions. Losses were within acceptable parameters given enemy defensive preparations. Recommend continued production and deployment across all theaters. The recommendation was implemented. Production ramped to 4 vessels per week by early 1944. The Pacific became their proving ground. On June 15, 1944, at Saipan, 87 LCI-Ls landed the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions on beaches pre-sighted by Japanese artillery. The first wave hit at 0840. By 0855, 14 LCI-Ls had taken hits. 6 were burning, 3 had sunk in the surf, but the Marines were ashore, and by 10 o'clock they controlled a perimeter 1,200 yards deep. At Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, 93 LCI-Ls participated in the initial assault. Casualties among the landing craft crews were severe. Japanese defenders had prepared the beaches with interlocking fields of fire specifically designed to destroy vessels in the surf zone. LCI-L466 took an artillery round through the troop compartment at 0902, killing 43 Marines before they could disembark. LCI-L760 burned for 6 hours after a direct hit ignited fuel stores. Yet the mission succeeded. The brutal calculus of amphibious warfare was straightforward. If troops reached the beach in sufficient numbers, the landing craft had done their job, regardless of the cost. By mid-1945, LCILs had participated in every major amphibious operation in both Europe and the Pacific. They were proven, reliable, and, critically, available in numbers that made large-scale operations possible. Which is precisely why, when Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov approached the U.S. State Department in March 1945 with a request for amphibious warfare vessels, the LCIL topped the list. The Soviets needed capability, and they needed it immediately. Stalin had committed to entering the Pacific War within 3 months of Germany's defeat. That meant August 8th at the latest. Soviet ground forces could steamroll Japanese positions in Manchuria, but only if they could reach them. The Japanese controlled the Kuril Islands, Sakhalin, and the Korean coast. Soviet naval infantry had no means to assault defended beaches. Project Hula solved that problem. Transfer complete vessels, not just equipment. Provide training. Do it in Alaska, far from prying eyes and Japanese intelligence networks. Make the Soviets capable of executing the operations that the Yalta Agreement required. By May 7th, when the first LCIL arrived at Cold Bay, the strategic logic was sound. What no one could predict was how little time would remain between training and combat. The transfer program proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Between May 7 and July 18, 1945, 30 LCILs changed hands at Cold Bay. The pattern was consistent. American crews would sail the vessel north from Seattle, arrive at the Aleutian base, and spend 3 to 4 days conducting systems checks and documentation reviews. Soviet crews, typically 43 men per vessel, matching the standard American complement, would arrive by transport ship from Kamchatka and begin intensive training. The curriculum was brutal in its compression. Day 1, basic familiarization with diesel engine systems. Day 2, navigation and chart work. Day 3, beaching procedures and ramp operations. Day 4, damage control and firefighting. Day 5, defensive gunnery. Days 6 through 9, practical exercises in Aleutian waters, simulating combat landings on empty beaches, while American instructors observed and corrected. Captain William S. Maxwell, commanding the Project Hula training program, later wrote, "We taught in 15 days what normally requires 8 weeks. The Soviet crews were competent seamen, but amphibious doctrine was entirely foreign to their experience. They adapted with impressive speed, though I held no illusions about their readiness for complex operations." The first batch of vessels, 12 LCILs redesignated DS-1 through DS-12, completed training by May 22 and departed for Petropavlovsk on May 24. The second batch, 9 vessels, DS-13 through DS-21, finished training on June 18 and sailed on June 20. The third batch, 9 vessels, DS-22 through DS-30, completed the program on July 13 and departed July 15. They were to join a fleet assembling in complete secrecy on the Kamchatka Peninsula. American intelligence knew that Soviet forces were staging for operations against Japanese-held territories, but the specific targets and timelines remained unclear even to the U.S. personnel conducting the training. What was clear, these vessels were going into action, soon. Soviet planning documents, declassified decades later, reveal the intended targets. Sakhalin Island's southern half, still held by Japan since the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, and the Kuril Island chain, particularly the heavily fortified northern islands of Shumshu and Paramushir. Shumshu presented a nightmare scenario for amphibious assault. The island was 8 miles long and 5 miles wide, dominated by high ground offering commanding views of every potential landing beach. Japanese forces had spent 4 years fortifying the island with coastal artillery, machine gun bunkers, minefields, and prepared infantry positions. Intelligence estimates placed defensive strength at approximately 8,500 troops from the 91st Infantry Division, supported by substantial artillery, including 150mm guns capable of engaging ships at ranges exceeding 20,000 meters. The Soviets would be assaulting prepared defenses with newly transferred American landing craft crewed by men who had 9 to 15 days of training. But that was the mission. The Soviet Pacific Fleet, reinforced by Project Hula transfers, would conduct simultaneous operations against Sakhalin and the Kurils, seizing territory that Stalin considered historically Russian and strategically vital. The timeline accelerated beyond anyone's initial planning. Germany surrendered on May 2nd. Stalin had promised to enter the Pacific War within 3 months. Soviet operational planners originally anticipated beginning offensive operations in mid-August, allowing time for forces to deploy and conduct final preparations. Then, on August 6th, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, 2 days ahead of the 3-month deadline. On August 9th, the atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On that same day, Soviet forces launched massive offensives across the Manchurian border. And on August 18th, just 10 days after the declaration of war, and 6 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's intention to surrender, Soviet amphibious forces launched Operation Landing at Shumshu Island. The LCILs transferred at Cold Bay were about to experience combat. Not in some future invasion, not after months of additional training and preparation, immediately. The vessels designated DS-5, DS-9, DS-13, DS-18, and DS-27 would not survive the day. August 18, 1945, 02:15, Kurabe Bay, Kamchatka Peninsula. Rear Admiral Boris D. Popov stood on the bridge of the minesweeper T-278 and reviewed the assault plan one final time. The operation had been planned for weeks, but recent events, the atomic bombs, the Emperor's surrender announcement, had injected profound uncertainty into the mission. Japan had announced its intention to surrender, but intention was not fact. No formal surrender document had been signed. Japanese forces in the Kurils had received no orders to stand down, and Stalin's orders were explicit: seize the territory before any surrender could formalize Japan's territorial claims. The amphibious force assembled before dawn consisted of 16 vessels, 2 older minesweepers serving as command ships, 8 submarine chasers providing escort, and 6 LCILs, now designated DS-5, DS-8, DS-9, DS-13, DS-18, and DS-27, carrying 8,824 naval infantry from the 101st Rifle Division. The plan was straightforward: land in 2 waves on beaches designated red and yellow on Shumshu's northern coast, establish a beachhead, advance inland to secure the high ground before Japanese artillery could organize effective resistance. Simple in concept, horrifyingly difficult in execution. At 4 a.m., the fleet departed Kurabe Bay. The crossing took 4 hours through heavy fog that reduced visibility to less than 500 meters. Navigation was by dead reckoning. Soviet charts of the Kuril waters were decades old and unreliable. At 08:20, the fog lifted enough to reveal Shumshu's northern coastline, and Japanese coastal batteries opened fire immediately. The Soviet after-action report, filed by Rear Admiral Popov on August 25th, provides clinical detail. At 08:23, enemy artillery engaged the assault force at a range of approximately 12,000 meters. Initial salvos fell short by 300 to 400 meters but quickly corrected. At 08:27, DS-9 took a direct hit amidships. The vessel listed severely and began taking water. At 08:30, the first wave landed on Red Beach under intense artillery and machine gun fire. What the report doesn't convey is the chaos. Petty Officer Mikhail Kravchenko, serving aboard DS-13, later testified, "We could see the shells hitting the water around us. Huge columns of spray, white in the gray morning light. The Zampolit, political officer, was shouting encouragement, but you couldn't hear anything over the engines and the explosions. Then DS-9 was just gone, burning, men in the water. We kept going because there was nothing else to do." The LCIL design had proven effective in dozens of Pacific landings. But those operations had benefited from naval gunfire support, air superiority, and preliminary bombardment that suppressed enemy defenses. The Soviet assault had none of those advantages. The surface fleet lacked heavy ships capable of counter-battery fire. Soviet air support was minimal, a handful of fighters that contributed little against dug-in positions. The assault relied on speed and shock to overcome defensive preparations. It wasn't enough. DS-9 sank at 08:35 with 68 men trapped below decks. DS-5 grounded on an uncharted sandbar 200 meters offshore at 08:41 and took sustained fire from machine gun positions that turned the surf zone into a killing field. 73 naval infantry died in the water attempting to wade ashore. DS-18 successfully beached on Red Beach at 08:44, dropped its ramps and began discharging troops. A 150mm shell struck the portside ramp at 08:46, detonating ammunition being carried by troops in the landing queue. The explosion killed 92 men instantly and ignited fuel stores. The vessel burned for 6 hours. DS-13 and DS-27 managed to land troops successfully on Yellow Beach under lighter fire, but both vessels sustained significant damage from artillery near misses that ruptured hull plates and disabled steering mechanisms. DS-27 was later judged beyond economical repair. By noon, Soviet forces had established a precarious toehold on Shumshu. Approximately 3,000 troops were ashore, but they were penned on the beaches by Japanese artillery firing from positions that remained untouched by Soviet counter-battery fire. Casualties mounted throughout the afternoon as Japanese infantry counterattacked from prepared positions. Captain Nikolai Vilkov, commanding the 302nd Rifle Regiment, filed a brutally honest assessment. The landing craft delivered troops to the beach. That is the extent to which the operation succeeded. Enemy defensive fires were far heavier than intelligence assessments indicated. Without naval gunfire support or effective air cover, advancing from the beach proved extremely costly. The battle continued for 3 days. Soviet forces eventually secured Shumshu through weight of numbers and sheer determination, but the cost was staggering. 1,567 Soviet casualties, including 516 killed. Japanese defensive forces suffered approximately 1,018 casualties, with 300 killed. 5 LCILs, vessels transferred just weeks earlier, crewed by men trained for 9 to 15 days, were sunk or damaged beyond repair. The American-built landing craft, designed for island-hopping campaigns supported by the full weight of the U.S. Navy's firepower, had been thrown into combat under conditions their designers never anticipated. The examination that followed revealed the fundamental problem. These were not poorly designed vessels. They were brilliantly designed for the missions the U.S. Navy conducted: multi-stage operations with extensive preliminary bombardment, air superiority, and layered support that suppressed enemy defenses before troops hit the beach. The Soviets had the vessels. They had trained crews. What they lacked was doctrine, support infrastructure, and time. The mathematics were unforgiving. An LCIL could land 188 troops in a single sortie. But if Japanese artillery could engage the vessel in the surf zone, casualty rates could exceed 50% before troops ever reached dry sand. Without suppressing fires, without air cover, the landing craft became little more than floating coffins. Commander Maxwell, reviewing intelligence reports of the Shumshu operation in late August, wrote a private letter to a colleague at the Bureau of Ships. "We gave them the tools. We trained them to operate the equipment. But we couldn't give them 3 years of hard-won Pacific experience. They learned at Shumshu what we learned at Tarawa. Amphibious assault requires more than ships. It requires a system. And that system is written in blood." The LCIL design specifications were issued by the Bureau of Ships on May 18, 1942, in response to a direct request from Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. The requirements were precise. Displacement, not to exceed 400 tons to permit construction at smaller yards. Range, 8,000 nautical miles at economical speed. Troop capacity, minimum 150, preferably 180-200 combat-loaded infantry. Beaching capability, able to ground bow first on sand or gravel beaches. Discharge method, forward ramps permitting rapid troop exit. Defensive armament, sufficient to suppress light enemy resistance. Construction time, 120 days or less from keel laying to commissioning. Cost, not to exceed $400,000 per vessel. These requirements emerged from brutal lessons learned during early amphibious operations. The August 1942 Dieppe raid had demonstrated the catastrophic cost of assaulting defended beaches without proper equipment. Of 6,066 men landed, 3,623 were killed, wounded, or captured. Tanks couldn't climb the seawall. Infantry landing craft had no ramps, forcing troops to climb over gunwales while under fire. The U.S. Navy was determined not to repeat those mistakes. The designer assigned to the project was George Crouch, a naval architect with the New York Shipbuilding Corporation who had previously worked on merchant vessel designs. Crouch understood the impossible choice he faced. To achieve 8,000-mile range with a 400-ton displacement meant maximum possible fuel capacity. That required minimizing every other weight element. To carry 188 troops meant dedicating approximately 40% of internal volume to troop spaces. To beach bow first required a flat-bottomed hull design that sacrificed seakeeping for shallow draft. The mathematics were brutally simple. The LCIL design had approximately 220 tons available for structure, propulsion, fuel, armament, and equipment after accounting for troop capacity and basic hull requirements. Every pound spent on armor was a pound not available for fuel or armament. Every inch of hull plating added weight that reduced range or required more powerful and heavier engines. Crouch made the defining choice: prioritize mission capability over survivability. The LCIL hull plating was specified at 3/16 inch, thick enough to withstand normal sea states, thin enough to keep structural weight manageable. No armor plating protected the engine spaces, the pilot house, or the troop compartments. The philosophy was clear. The vessel's defense was its ability to complete the mission quickly, not its ability to withstand sustained fire. This was not a flaw. It was a calculated trade-off based on operational assumptions that proved valid for American operations. LCILs would land troops after preliminary bombardment had suppressed defensive fires. They would operate under air cover that prevented enemy aircraft from attacking. They would beach, discharge, and retract before enemy artillery could zero in on stationary targets. American LCIL crews accepted this trade-off because they understood the system supporting them. When LCIL 449 took an artillery hit at Iwo Jima, killing 17 men, the vessel was able to withdraw because American airstrikes were simultaneously hitting Japanese gun positions, and American destroyers were conducting counter-battery fire that forced Japanese gunners to take cover. The Soviet crews at Shumshu had no such support. The vessels performed exactly as designed, but the operational environment bore no resemblance to what American planners had assumed. The diesel engines, 8 General Motors 671 units producing 1,440 total horsepower, were reliable and fuel-efficient but required constant maintenance. American crews had access to extensive logistical support networks that provided spare parts, qualified mechanics, and replacement engines when necessary. Soviet forces in Kamchatka had none of that infrastructure. The defensive armament, 5 20mm Ehrlichen cannons, was effective against small boats and aircraft, but useless against fortified positions or artillery from thousands of meters away. American doctrine assumed that heavy fire support would handle those threats. Soviet doctrine assumed nothing, because Soviet amphibious doctrine was being invented in real time using transferred American equipment. The design reflected American operational philosophy: highly capable specialized equipment operating as one element in a complex system. Remove the system, and the equipment's weaknesses became fatal vulnerabilities. George Crouch's design wasn't wrong. It was optimized for conditions that didn't exist at Shumshu, and approximately 800 Soviet naval infantry paid the price for that mismatch between design assumptions and combat reality. The Battle of Shumshu on August 18, 1945, was the bloodiest engagement involving Project Hula transferred vessels, but it was not the only instance where Soviet forces learned the hard limits of equipment operating outside its designed context. August 20, 1945. 2 days after the Shumshu assault, Soviet forces launched amphibious operations against Paramushir Island, the next island in the Kuril chain. 12 landing craft participated, including 4 LCILs designated DS-12, DS-16, DS-22, and DS-30. Japanese resistance was lighter. Most defensive forces had already received surrender orders and were in the process of standing down. But the lessons of equipment mismatch remained. DS-22 suffered a complete engine failure during the approach, leaving the vessel dead in the water 6,000 meters from the landing beach. Towing the disabled craft proved impossible in heavy seas. The vessel was eventually beached deliberately to prevent loss of the troops aboard, but the incident revealed a critical weakness. Soviet maintenance capabilities could not support the complex diesel systems under field conditions. August 25, 1945. Soviet forces conducted amphibious operations against Sakhalin Island's southern coast. 8 LCILs participated in the assault on Myoka, now Komsk. Resistance was minimal. Japan had formally surrendered on August 15, though local commanders had not yet implemented surrender orders. Nevertheless, DS-7 struck an uncharted reef while approaching the beach, tearing a 4-meter gash in the hull. The vessel sank in shallow water. All troops aboard evacuated safely, but the loss illustrated another vulnerability. Soviet charts of Japanese-controlled waters were inadequate, and the LCIL's flat-bottomed design offered no protection against underwater obstacles. The mathematics of attrition tell the story. August 18, 1945, Shumshu assault. 6 LCILs committed. 5 sunk or damaged beyond repair: DS-5, DS-9, DS-13, DS-18, DS-27. 516 Soviet personnel killed, 1,051 wounded. August 20, 1945, Paramushir operation. 4 LCILs committed. 1 disabled, DS-22, eventually beached. 28 Soviet personnel killed, 82 wounded. Casualties primarily from ground combat, not landing operations. August 25, 1945, Sakhalin landings. 8 LCILs committed. 1 sunk, DS-7. 12 Soviet personnel killed, 34 wounded. By the end of August 1945, 7 of the 30 LCILs transferred to the Soviet Union had been lost to combat damage or accidents. That's a loss rate of 23% in less than 2 weeks of active operations, rates that would be unsustainable in any prolonged campaign. Soviet Lieutenant Igor Kuzmin, who survived the sinking of DS-9 at Shumshu, later wrote, "The Americans gave us ships that worked perfectly. The engines ran, the ramps dropped, the radios functioned. But we were sending these ships into battles the Americans never intended them to fight, operated by crews who had 2 weeks of training instead of 2 years of experience. It's a miracle any of us survived." The Soviet Navy attempted several modifications to improve survivability. In September 1945, surviving LCI-Ls were fitted with additional steel plating around the pilot house and engine spaces, improvised armor that added approximately 12 tons of weight per vessel. This reduced top speed from 15.5 knots to 13 knots and decreased range by nearly 1,500 miles due to increased fuel consumption. The modifications were removed within months because they made the vessels unsuitable for their primary mission. Additional defensive armament was also attempted. DS-14 was fitted with 2 Soviet-manufactured 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine guns in place of the forward 20mm Ehrlichons. The experiment failed because ammunition compatibility issues meant the new guns couldn't be effectively supplied during operations. The original Ehrlichons were reinstalled. The fundamental problem was unsolvable through modifications. The LCIL was designed to operate within a comprehensive American naval system that provided layered defense, extensive logistical support, and doctrine refined through years of combat experience. Soviet forces had the ships, but not the system. Post-war analysis by Soviet naval theorists acknowledged this frankly. A 1947 General Staff study on amphibious operations noted, "The transfer of American landing craft under Project Hula provided immediate capability that Soviet industry could not have produced in the available time frame. However, equipment alone does not constitute operational capability. The losses sustained in the Kuril operations demonstrate that technical systems must be matched to operational doctrine and supported by appropriate infrastructure." Perhaps the most telling incident occurred on September 2, 1945, the day Japan formally surrendered aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Soviet forces were conducting occupation landings on the northern Kuril Islands, using LCILs to transport troops to islands where Japanese garrisons had already laid down their arms. DS-19, carrying a platoon of naval infantry to occupy a communications station on Wonokanaton Island, ran aground on a volcanic rock shelf that didn't appear on Soviet charts. The vessel's thin hull plating tore open along a 12-foot section of the keel. No one was killed, the waters were calm, and Japanese forces helped with the evacuation, but the incident crystallized the absurdity. An American landing craft, transferred to Soviet control, crewed by Russians trained for 9 days in Alaska, conducting occupation duties against an enemy who had already surrendered, destroyed by a rock because no one had accurate charts. The vessel was abandoned in place. It remains there today, rusted hull visible at low tide, a monument to the chaotic final days of World War II. Between May and July 1945, the United States transferred exactly 30 LCI L-class landing craft to the Soviet Union under Project Hula. The complete list with Soviet designations. First Transfer Group, May 7 through 22, 1945. DS-1 through DS-12, formerly USS LCI L-585, 587, 589, 591, 593, 595, 597, 599, 601, 603, 605, 607. Second Transfer Group, June 1 through 18, 1945. DS-13 through DS-21, formerly USS LCI L-672, 674, 676, 678, 680, 682, 684, 686, 688. Third Transfer Group, June 25 through July 18, 1945. DS-22 through DS-30, formerly USS LCIL 760, 762, 764, 766, 778, 770, 772, 774, 776. All 30 vessels were LCIL Mark II variants, featuring length 159 feet, beam 23 feet 3 inches, draft 4 feet 3 inches forward, 5 feet 8 inches aft, displacement 387 tons fully loaded, propulsion 8 GM671 diesel engines, 1,440 total horsepower, maximum speed 15 knots, 5 knots, cruising speed 12 knots, range 8,000 nautical miles at 12 knots, troop capacity 188 combat-loaded infantry, crew 43, 4 officers, 39 enlisted, armament 5 20mm Oerlikon cannons, 2 forward, 2 amidships, 1 aft. By September 15, 1945, 7 of these 30 vessels had been lost. Combat losses: DS-5, sunk by artillery fire, Shumshu, August 18, 1945. DS-9, sunk by artillery fire, Shumshu, August 18, 1945. DS-18, burned and sunk, Shumshu, August 18, 1945. Combat damage, total loss: DS-13, damaged beyond repair, Shumshu, August 18, 1945. DS-27, damaged beyond repair, Shumshu, August 18, 1945. Operational losses: DS-7, sunk after striking reef, Sakhalin, August 25, 1945. DS-19, grounded and abandoned, Wanakotan Island, September 2, 1945. That's a 23% loss rate in less than 1 month of operations. Soviet casualties directly attributable to landing craft losses totaled approximately 312 killed and 487 wounded. These figures include crew members killed aboard the vessels and naval infantry who died attempting to evacuate sinking ships or reach shore from damaged craft. Soviet Navy seaman Anatoly Sokolov, who served aboard DS-11 during the Kuril operations, was one of the survivors. In a 1989 interview, he recalled, "We trained for 2 weeks. 2 weeks to learn what American sailors spent months mastering. Then we sailed into combat against an enemy who had spent 4 years preparing to kill us. 7 of our ships didn't come back. It's a testament to American engineering that 23 of them did." The remaining 23 vessels served in the Soviet Pacific Fleet through the late 1940s. Maintenance proved challenging. Spare parts had to be manufactured in Soviet facilities from reverse-engineered American components, a process that introduced quality control issues. By 1950, only 16 of the transferred LCILs remained in active service. The comparative analysis reveals the design philosophy gap. American LCIL operations, 1943 to 1945, 351 vessels commissioned, 79 lost to all causes. Combat, weather, accidents equals 22.5% loss rate. However, these losses occurred over 2 years across dozens of operations. Average crew survival rate when vessel was hit, 67%. Soviet DS operations, August-September 1945, 30 vessels transferred, 7 lost in 1 month, equals 23% loss rate. Average crew survival rate when vessel was hit, 41%. The difference in survival rates reflect operational context. American LCILs hit during combat could usually rely on immediate rescue efforts by accompanying vessels, air cover that suppressed follow-up attacks, and medical support that treated casualties within minutes. Soviet vessels operated in a much less developed support environment. The philosophical difference was stark. American approach: protect crews through system-level support, air cover, naval gunfire, medical evacuation, extensive training. Accept equipment losses as inevitable but maximize personnel survival. Soviet approach, forced by circumstances: operate equipment at the edge of crew capability in environments the equipment wasn't designed for. Accept higher casualties as the cost of achieving strategic objectives on an accelerated timeline. Which approach succeeded? By one measure, territorial control, the Soviet approach achieved its objectives. Stalin wanted the Kurils and southern Sakhalin. Soviet forces, using American equipment, seized those territories. They remain under Russian control today. But the human cost was severe. Approximately 1,567 Soviet casualties to seize islands that Japan was in the process of surrendering. 5 landing craft sunk in a single day. Hundreds of men killed operating equipment they barely understood in combat scenarios the equipment wasn't designed to survive. The American approach, refined through years of Pacific combat, produced the same territorial results with lower casualty rates because the system supported the equipment. The Soviet experience proved that transplanting equipment without transplanting the supporting system produces short-term capability at long-term cost. May 7, 1945. Cold Bay, Alaska. Lieutenant Commander Patterson watching the first Soviet crew board LCIL-585. August 18, 1945. Shumshu Island. That same vessel, now DS-1, burning in the surf zone. Soviet naval infantry struggling through chest-deep water toward a beach swept by machine gun fire. The 93-day journey from transfer to combat encapsulated the entire strange final chapter of World War II in the Pacific. Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Among the dozens of Allied vessels present in Tokyo Bay, 3 were Soviet: a cruiser, a destroyer, and a minesweeper. No LCILs. They were 800 miles north, conducting occupation duties in the Kurils, securing territory that would become one of the longest-running territorial disputes of the post-war era. The final irony is inescapable. The landing craft transferred at Cold Bay were built for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan that never happened. They were meant to land American troops on Kyushu in November 1945, part of an operation that would have dwarfed D-Day and cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. Instead, they landed Soviet troops on Japanese-held islands in August 1945, in operations that occurred after Japan had announced surrender but before formal surrender documents were signed. They fought in battles that were technically unnecessary. Japan was defeated, but strategically vital to Stalin's territorial ambitions. The lesson extends far beyond World War II amphibious operations. Military equipment is not hardware alone. It is hardware plus doctrine, plus training, plus logistical support, plus operational experience. Separate the equipment from that ecosystem, and effectiveness plummets. The United States learned this lesson repeatedly in the decades that followed. Military assistance programs that transferred advanced equipment to Allied nations often failed to produce expected capabilities because the equipment wasn't matched to the recipient's doctrine, training, or support infrastructure. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. The pattern repeated. Sophisticated American equipment operating at a fraction of its potential effectiveness because the supporting system wasn't there. The Soviets learned it at Shumshu. 7 landing craft lost, 516 men killed, for islands that Japan was surrendering anyway. The examination of DS-1's wreckage, conducted by Soviet naval engineers in October 1945, confirmed what Lieutenant Commander Patterson had worried about that morning in May. The vessel was exactly as designed. a brilliantly engineered amphibious assault ship optimized for American operational doctrine. Thin-hulled because American doctrine provided naval gunfire support. Lightly armed because American doctrine assumed air superiority. Operationally complex because American doctrine assumed extensively trained crews. Remove those assumptions, and the design's strengths became weaknesses. The LCI L-class landing craft that arrived at Cold Bay in spring 1945 were not poorly designed. They were brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals within a specific operational system. Those goals simply did not include throwing minimally trained crews into combat against prepared defenses without the support infrastructure that made American amphibious operations successful. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why equipment alone never wins wars. Systems win wars. Training wins wars. Doctrine wins wars. Experience wins wars. The hardware just gives you the opportunity to apply those advantages. Without them, even the best-built war machine becomes a floating coffin waiting for the enemy to find its range. The landing craft that arrived too late for the invasion of Japan arrived just in time to learn that lesson in the cold waters off Shumshu. The men who died aboard DS-5, DS-9, DS-13, DS-18, and DS-27 paid for that education with their lives. Their sacrifice secured islands that most people have never heard of, in a war that was already over in all but the signing of documents. But it taught a lesson that remains relevant wherever sophisticated equipment is transferred without the system that makes it effective. The lesson endures. The men do not. That is the mathematics of war, unchanged since Shumshu and unchanged still.